Hey you guys, this is Jessica and Noam. We're here today at Trax with Reverb for another episode of What's That Sound? And today we are breaking down the drum sound of Give It Away Now by the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
It's crazy. It is super 90s. It's really aggressive. The Chili Boys done did it again. Let's check it out.
So for our drums, we have a 1970s Gretsch kit that we used for this track, and then we have Chad Smith's signature Pearl snare.
We started out with that snare because of course we did. We then were not getting the sound with that, so we switched it out to a couple different snares, and then we ended up going back to that snare and just cranking it as high as it would possibly go, and that was the sound.
So once we got our snare figured out, we moved on to our cymbals. We use Zildjian cymbals today, and we have a pair of 14-inch K-Sweet hats and an 18-inch Dark Crash.
Okay, the trick to this drum sound is get out every mic that you own. Put them on the drum set. Every single mic, put it on. We used 14 microphones on this drum sound. For the time, it was a lot. Considering how many tracks you had on tape machines, it was quite a bit. For this drum sound, we used a kick-in mic that was a Biodynamic M88. We used a kick-out mic that was a FET 47. Our snare top microphone was an interesting one. We used a 57, but right next to it, we used an AKG 451. Now, to do this, you have to be very, very careful that the two capsules are exactly in the same place. Otherwise, you're gonna end up with some phase problems. But if you line them up just perfectly, what you end up with is two sides of the same sound that kind of fill each other in. So you have your super mid-range, right, very forward sound, that's from our 57, and we have our 451, which gives us a extreme amount of high end. It gives us a deeper low end than a 57 is gonna give. And those two together makes a much more well-rounded snare drum sound, and you don't have to EQ it quite as much. On our hi-hat, we used a Neumann KM84. On toms, we put up Sennheiser 421s. Those are just for show. She didn't play any toms on this song, so we didn't use them. On our overheads, we actually did 3 overheads. Now, I did this because in a documentary I saw about them making this record, I saw them have 3 overheads. They used 3 U87s. I think it was because they had so many drums in the drum kit and it was so wide that they needed an extra microphone to kind of make sure that it didn't get too hollow in the center. For today, that probably wasn't necessary, but we did it anyways just for fun. On the sides, on the left and right, we used a pair of Schoeps microphones, condenser microphones, and in our center we used a Neumann U87 vintage from the 70s. For our room microphones, we used a pair of Coles 4038s. Now I chose those microphones because first off, they're bidirectional, so they sound great on rooms. They are dark, right? So they don't have a lot of cymbals. The room microphones on this song are really, really important. They're really interesting. They recorded this song in like a big old mansion, right? So they probably had room mics up in the ceiling or something that could get a ton of length and a ton of depth out of the drums. For today, I put the room mics as far back as I could and as wide as I could. Now, the reason I put them as wide as I could was because we're gonna do something really weird with our room mics, right? We are going to not only gate our room mics, but we're not going for like a Phil Collins gating sound. So instead, we are gonna take our room mics, multiply them to 2 inputs on our console, and we're gonna process them differently. On the first set of inputs, right, a pair of stereo room mics, we are going to just compress them with a Chandler TG1. It's set to limit. It just gives us a nice general compressed room sound that you would like use on a typical rock record currently. On the second set, we did not compress those drums. We first ran them through a noise gate. Now that noise gate is set to trigger off of our snare drum. So every time the snare drum hits, the room microphones are gonna open up temporarily, and then they're gonna mute themselves after a second or so. That creates a significant problem, which is those room mics have a lot of other things in them other than snare drum. They have a lot of cymbals, they have a lot of kick drum, they have a lot of other stuff. So we were really careful to make sure that those room mics were dark enough where you would not feel the cymbals rush in too much every time the snare drum got hit. We also made sure that those room mics were super wide so that they felt like a reverb when they got hit, right? It's only on the sides that these kind of room mics will jump up, and they'll add a ton of width and depth to this snare drum every time it gets hit. The last thing that we had to worry about with the snare drum was the length of the gate. We had to set it very specifically, and it's based on what song you're recording, right? It's based on the tempo of the song, because you don't want every time the snare drum hits for the kick drum to get changed or for the hi-hats to get changed terribly, right? So we set it as short as we could without allowing it to catch any of the other instruments that it was near. The last microphone that we added was a mono room mic that was super close up to the kit and very compressed. That is just a microphone to add energy to the drum set. We used a Neumann U47 because we had one, right? But you could probably use anything. We used it very, very sparingly in the mix, and it's just to add a little bit of extra energy to the track. Let's go through these mics one by one and take a listen. Here's our kick-in microphone. Aggressive, very aggressive, right? This is a stylistic thing for the time. We're adding a lot of 10K to this sound, a lot of like 3K to the sound, and we're sucking out quite a bit of 500 hertz, right? This is to make a very stylized 90s kick drum sound that's gonna like cut through a bunch of guitars. Here's our kick out mic. That's where all the body's coming from on the kick drum. Right, the kick out mic is giving us a ton of length. It's giving us a ton of 100 hertz and a ton of 50 hertz and all these things that the kick in microphone is kind of lacking. This is filling in. Here's our snare top. We're EQing a decent amount on this, right? We're adding quite a bit of high end. We're adding a lot of 10K. We're also adding a little bit of mid range. We're adding a little bit of 1K. But alone, it's kind of a mid-rangey sound. So let's take a look at our 451. 451 is kind of filling in some of the stuff that the 57 didn't capture, and together, they make a pretty well-rounded snare drum sound. Now here's our bottom snare. It's just gonna add a little bit of extra sizzle. Great. Let's check out our hi-hat mic. Sounds great. Sounds like some hi-hats. Move on. Let's hear our overheads. Compression on these, right? We took away some of the low end, we added some high end, and we compressed them pretty decently because it's a 90s rock record. We need a bunch of compression on it, right? We have a fast compressor on it, right? So it's not popping the snare out too much because we don't need a ton of snare from these overheads. We just need a lot of cymbals. Let's look at our first set of room mics. Sound great on their own, right? We're only using them a little bit. Now here's our second set of room mics, and these are the ones with the noise gates on them. Sounds ridiculous. Sounds completely crazy. However, if we put these room mics together, right, all 4 channels of room mics, it still sounds crazy. It doesn't sound that much better. However, if we put it with our overheads and our snare drum, it starts to sound very stylish. It starts to sound like the 90s. Let's add in our center overhead mic. Sounds fine. I don't know. I probably wouldn't have done it, but it feels cool. And here's our mono room mic. Just a little bit of an extra sound, a little bit of added energy. Who knows if we need this, but the trend with big rock records was to over mic the drums a little bit, so that you didn't need to change the setup so dramatically song to song. The last thing that we added to this sound was reverb. Supposedly, there's rumors that they might have not used reverb on these drums. I personally do not believe that. To me, the record sounds like there is a very short reverb on the snare drum. It is probably in conjunction with the gated room. Today, what I ended up doing was I triggered the reverb off of the snare drum and also off of the gated room. It's kind of convoluted. It's the snare drum is triggering the room gates, and the room gates are sending to the reverb, right? But the feeling that I got from that was just adding length to my room sound, right? So it wasn't that I was just adding snare drum reverb, right? I was adding length to the reverb that I already had. So here's just the reverb sound. And here's the reverb and just the gated rooms. Works together. They kind of feel like one gated reverb thing. The reverb I used was a Valhalla room verb set to 1 second, and AMS RMX16 set to nonlinear and set to about 2 seconds. Let's listen to everything together. That's the drum sound for Give It Away by the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Please let us know in the comments what other songs you'd like to see us break down, and we'll see you next time.